Lots of watercolour artists believe that you cannot use watercolour on canvas. Even more watercolour artists believe that you should not use watercolours on canvas and believe that you should only ever paint on watercolour paper. So I am here today to say that it is absolutely possible and to share with you some of the pros and cons. So by the end of this video, you can decide whether watercolour on canvas is the right thing for you and for your next watercolour project. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire. Every week I share tips and tricks that I wish I'd known about ages ago. I am passionate about watercolour and I'm pretty jolly enthusiastic about watercolour on canvas. So much so that I have written a book about it. And I also run a Facebook group that's got over 10,000 members from around the world. So just to answer the "you can't paint watercolour on canvas," well, that's obviously not true. Whether you should is a bit more nuanced. So as I show you the different canvases that are available and how you might prepare your own watercolour canvas and things like that, I've been really lucky because Phoenix Art Materials have sent me a whole load of their canvases to try out. And just to prove it, look, lots. So I can show you all different styles. And I was amazed that Phoenix told me they make 10 million stretched canvases a year. I mean, that's ridiculous. That blows my mind. Are 10 million paintings painted a year? Anyway, that's what they do, and they make 80% of the world's stretched canvases. So they're based in China, and these canvases are shipped all around the world. So I can bet that you've used one of theirs. I'm going to show you ordinary canvas that's for acrylic and oils and how we turn it into a watercolour canvas. And let me find one. I'm going to show you canvases that are ready prepared, ready for watercolour, and I'm going to show you watercolour ground and all sorts of other things. So just before we get into the technicalities of canvas panels and thin edge and thick edge and whatever, it might be worth having a quick think about the pros and cons of using watercolour on canvas, and I have one to act as an example. So what attracted me to watercolour on canvas was size. I wanted to paint bigger, and of course I could paint on an imperial sheet of watercolour paper, or you can get double elephant, which is a massive piece of watercolour paper, and that's lovely. But I was scared of the thought of how would I frame this? You know, what would the glass weigh if I was trying to frame this huge picture? So that is one of the advantages of canvas. It's lightweight. It doesn't need to go under glass. You can paint big if that's what you want to do. The canvas is pretty durable. I say it's very easy to frame, or if you use a thick edge canvas like this, I think it looks great unframed. And we know that our watercolour paper, if it's a bit lightweight, maybe only 140 pounds, and you're painting large, can really start to buckle if you use lots of water. I mean, the way around that is that you use a thicker paper, but that comes at a price. The canvas will not buckle, so it is really durable. A canvas is also great for mixed media techniques, and if you're feeling quite experimental. And if I come closer, can you see the textures on this? I applied modelling paste using stencils of all these rainforest shapes all over it, and then I've painted my toucan on top of it. So if you fancy trying something different, canvas is a great surface for that. And look at the colours. They are very vibrant. It's still watercolour, but because it sits quite on the surface of the canvas, they stay vibrant, and it's also harder to overwork them. It's harder to lose that luminosity that we all love with watercolours. Very easy to lift, so great for corrections. And that brings me to some of the downsides. It's very easy to lift, so if you want to do layer upon layer, which is a very traditional watercolour technique, that's tricky. It's very easy to pick up the underlayers. Now, the manufacturers of watercolour ground, which is what we use, it's a very sort of absorbent gesso. It's a primer that just lets the canvas accept the watercolour. They say you can make any surface behave like a fine watercolour paper. Not 100% true. It will accept watercolour, but it does behave differently. So you're going to have to adapt your painting technique potentially, so that you can use it without getting too frustrated. And part of that adaptation of your technique is that drying times will be a lot longer, because again, the water and the colour sits more on the surface, so it doesn't dry through absorption, it dries by evaporation. So it means that you really have to be in control of your water. Pros definitely outweigh the cons, and I tried it for the first time, oh gosh, a decade ago, and absolutely fell in love with it. And I hope that you'll give it a go and not replace watercolour paper, because I love working on paper too, but it just expands your repertoire. Right, let's have a look at the different forms of canvas. Generally, we are working with a cotton canvas. You can get linen canvas, which is a lot finer and stronger because the linen fibre is stronger than cotton, but it's a lot more expensive and it tends to be a sort of beigey colour. So you can also work on unstretched canvas, but unstretched canvas will cockle just like watercolour paper. So let's just look at the sort of stretch canvas options. And the first one is canvas panels like this. Now this happens to be a watercolour canvas panel, but of course just ignore that and look at the panel. So it is canvas stretched over a board, and it's got paper on the back. The advantages of these are they come in all different sizes. I mean, these are the sizes that Phoenix do, but they're rigid. They are very portable because they're flat. They're very easy to store, not terribly expensive, and they are great for taking out and about if you're doing plein air work. But the downsides is that potentially that board can absorb lots of water, and that will actually warp if you get it wet. They will need framing. Then we get something like this, which is what I would call a thin-edged canvas. So you've got stretcher bars on the back, which are made of wood. They have little joints in the corner, which are sort of like this, which allow them to move. So if your canvas sags with time, you can actually re-stretch it by using those little wooden keys that you get with it. And it's designed for either oil or acrylics. So it's been gessoed, that's a primer, and it's got a medium texture. Generally, you'll find cheaper canvases might be a bit rougher, but you could look for a very fine weaved canvas. They come in different weights. I think that thin edge canvases like this still need to be framed. I think they look a bit mean if you hang them on the wall without any framing, but it's really simple to do. You can get what we call a tray frame. So as an alternative, this is something I've painted before, you can get thick edge canvas, and look how thick that is. That's what, about 3 centimetres, 1.5 inches. They do vary in depth. And I love thick edge canvases. You saw with that toucan, you don't need framing. They've actually got a 3D feel to them. So I really like painting on deep edge canvases. And I just wanted to show you another one. So this actually comes from Pan Art. It's not a Phoenix one. I've just come across it, not used it yet. It is actually a cradle board. So it's a wooden panel that has been covered in canvas. So whereas canvases bounce, they are soft in the middle, this is rigid. There, listen to that. And I think that might be interesting for mixed media if I was sticking lots of collage on that or doing thick impasto. That is going to be really interesting to use. These canvases are relatively small. That's just what I've been sent. But of course you can get canvases metre by a metre, 1.5 by a metre very easily. Or you can get canvases made to any size you want, but that will come at a price. Now, watercolour canvases can be tricky to find. Phoenix has got this huge range. There are other manufacturers that that have them, but if you live in a remote area, or depends what country you're in, they can be harder to find. Maybe you can get hold of ordinary canvases and think, oh, can I use that? Well, the big problem is that an ordinary canvas will actually repel the watercolour. It will bead up, it will lift, it won't flow, you won't be able to get all those beautiful merges and mingles that we love from watercolour, which is where this comes in. So if you can't get a ready prepared watercolour canvas, or you can't get one in the size you want or the profile you want, you can absolutely change an ordinary canvas into a watercolour one by adding, and I recommend 3 thin layers of watercolour ground. And if you think about this, it's like an absorbent gesso. So it primes the surface, makes it slightly absorbent so that we can get the merges and the mingles that we love. The advantage of buying a ready prepared canvas is that it's so convenient. Literally, I can take the plastic off this and get going. And I should find that every surface is really consistent. As you know, if I stay with a Phoenix brand, it'll be consistent this time, tomorrow, the next time I use it. But the disadvantage is of these ready prepared ones is availability, as I've already said, cost, maybe only available in limited sizes, and limited surface textures. You might be able to get a fine one and a medium one, but there isn't much else going on there. So preparing your own is certainly cheaper, I would suggest, and it's very customizable. You can make that surface how you want. The disadvantage of preparing your own is that it takes a while because this has to dry and has to cure, so it can be touch dry between coats, but I would leave it for at least 24 hours and hopefully a little bit longer to cure before you actually paint on it. Of course, you do need to actually make sure the coats of ground that you're using are nice and consistent, and that just takes a little bit of practice. So let me show you how easy it is to use watercolour ground that will transform just about any surface into something that will accept watercolour. I've got a rather old mucky canvas board and I'm going to use it now. You have options. Let's just look at the consistency. It is a white thick paste. You could, if you want texture, literally put it on with a palette knife and spread it around like that and get a very rough texture. Say you were doing a mountain scene, or you were doing just a landscape where you wanted, you know, a really rough texture. Most of the time you're definitely not going to want that. You could use a foam brush, that's good for spreading, or of course just use an ordinary brush, not your best watercolour brushes. Most of the time we want as few marks as possible, so frankly I like to use a little roller. I prepare lots at the same time to make clear up easier for me. Now on this roller, because it is so thick, you can see I've got quite a bobbly texture. If I don't like that, I can actually dilute this down just to make it a bit thinner and I'll get a flatter texture. I would add no more than 10%, because otherwise you are going to be diluting the binder and you will lose the binding and the absorbency properties. And say, I like Corolla just because it leaves no brush marks and it's really fast. So if I was doing some bigger canvases, then I can do a layer really quickly, let it dry, and then do the second and the third. What I sometimes like to do is let it dry and then sandpaper this just to get a smoother surface. Rather than cleaning the brush in the little tray in between those 3 layers, I just seal it inside a plastic bag and that keeps it all moist, and then I clean it all up at the end. A jar of this will last, well, pretty indefinitely, as long as you make sure that you put the lid back on properly and seal it. I've not used Phoenix's watercolour ground, so I'm really interested to see what it's like. Other manufacturers do make it, I like the fact that this is in a big jar, so it's what, 500 millilitres, just over a pint. You know, small jars I don't like so much because I tend to work large. People quite often say, you know, how much will a pot actually cover? It's tricky because how thick is the layer that you're putting on? We're aiming for 1 to 2 millimetres in thickness of those 3 layers together. It's not much. So actually a jar like this will go a long way. If you use a brush or palette knife, do clean it off while it's wet because, well, it's designed to stick. It'll stick to anything. If you get it on your clothing, it will not wash out once it's dry. After 3 layers of watercolour ground, this is what our board looks like. It's pretty smooth, not a lot of canvas showing, and very similar to their pre-prepared one. The only thing we could do if we wanted to is do a very light sand and just get a smoother surface. That watercolour ground really gives us the option of that super rough surface right through to a really smooth one. I would really recommend writing on the back of anything that you have coated what you've done, because say you've done a whole load of them at the same time. Frankly, one whiteboard looks remarkably like another whiteboard. So I think it must be about time that we actually try this jolly thing. And I've just opened, this is one of the pre-prepared canvases from Phoenix, and it's interesting because there's very, very little canvas texture on that. And just to compare, this is an ordinary canvas panel, and I don't know whether the camera will pick it up, but there's a lot more canvas texture. So that hasn't got watercolour ground, and this is one of the pre-prepared ones. Now, when I teach watercolour on canvas, the first exercise I do is a monochrome, because I think that just strips out some of the complication. And these are some of the little sample ones I've done as demonstrations, because it is different. It does feel different on canvas. Ooh, an upside down sheet. And by doing this, what I'm teaching the students is some of those differences. And the main one is that layering is really tricky. So we need to get our darks and our tones and our lights right first time as far as possible. So sometimes I get them to choose a really dark mass tone colour and to get it lighter step by step. This is all about water and pigment control. And then we put it into practice in a simple painting. And that's what I thought I'd do on here to see what it's like. Right, I know this is a bit shiny, but that's my reference photo, and I think I'll do this sheep on the grounds that I've never actually done it before. I'm going to do my sheep using indigo, which is a lovely, really dark blue. And I would always suggest using a synthetic brush rather than a very soft natural hairbrush, because the surface is pretty rough on your brushes. I'm using tube watercolour. Of course you can do this with pans. What I like to do is use a watercolour pencil to sketch out my composition, like just for a bit of fun, give it a slightly wilder hairstyle than it actually has in the photo. And a monochrome just gives us the opportunity to play around with the paint and the surface without having to worry about stopping and mixing the right colour and all those sorts of things. It just strips out a little bit of the complication. So I've gone in with some pretty strong paint, and then let's see how it moves. Does it shift around and give us lovely soft edges? Yes, it does. What happens if I drop extra in? Does it mix? Does it just sit there? I'm a bit of a fan of using a little spray. Look at how that goes on the surface. We really get a good woolly sheep there, don't we? In ordinary watercolour, we might build up our tones, but here, say, if we can get them right first time, it really does make our life an awful lot easier. And it'll be interesting to see how long it stays workable for. Feeling pretty smooth to work on. I can do wet in wet, and I can do wet on dry. It doesn't shift around. pretty fine marks. And that's just so I can soften off the edges like that. I always love how the colour just flows on the surface. So if you've never worked on watercolour canvas, just have a little play. I wouldn't go in for, I don't know, a commission on your first piece. I do sometimes get messages from people saying, oh, I've been commissioned to do this and I've never used watercolour canvas before. And you're like, oh, you do make your life a little tricky, don't you? So sometimes it might be sensible just to have a little play. So I'm just using some water and letting some of that flow to, oh, look at that lovely mark. Come off over to that other ear, and again, really try and get my sort of darks in first time. It's interesting, actually. I can see sort of almost little bubbles coming out of the canvas as the water sinks in. And again, what I say to my students is that I would aim to get 85% of the work done in the first layer and then let it dry, and then we can come back in and amend things and get another, I don't know, 10% done, and then the final 5%, it might be whiskers or hair or whatever. So we're trying, that is 3 layers, but the first layer is going to do all the heavy lifting for us. Come off here. Can you see that's just caught that lovely lightness? I've got some salt here in a pot, introducing lots of texture. So let's see what that is going to do on our canvas surface. Right, we'll let that dry and then I'll come back in. Let's come back to our monochrome sheet, because that first layer that we hope has done 85% of the work is pretty dry. And we can, now I just want to show you how wonderful this surface is for lifting and correcting and amending. So if I take a short flat brush and make sure it's damp but not sopping, soften this edge here. So I can just tickle that, maybe dab away some of that lucent pigment, and I can soften an edge. And say I want to just straighten that up and didn't want my sheet to have a wonky edge to its ear, I can absolutely do that. This line that I've done down the centre of its face is very harsh. I want to soften that. In fact, it's so easy to soften edges that it might make us a little bit lazy. On canvas, we can move the paint around to our heart's content. If we looked at this morning and thought, that's the worst sheep I've ever seen in my life, we could wash it off under a tap. There'd be maybe a bit of a stain, but we could reuse our canvas board. To say here, my sheep actually has some very lovely eyelashes, which I didn't use at all. I can put those in. Should just point out that the salt that I put on here hasn't been very dramatic, and I've scraped it off. Whether salt works or not is often down to the pigment you use. In this second layer, we do need to use a very light touch if we are trying to layer rather than to lift. Soft brush, light touch, not too much water in that. If you want more tips on painting on canvas, I've got some, so I'll put a link to those at the end. I think we've got to the end of where this little blue sheep is going. It's shown us loads of those properties of watercolour on canvas, how we can do wet on dry, wet on wet, how if we're careful we can layer, but how that can be tricky, but how we can get interesting flows and textures. If you've never used watercolour on canvas before, I really recommend getting a little panel and trying a monochrome. If you've used it before and are feeling adventurous, why not prepare your own canvas using watercolour ground and see all those different textures that you could achieve with it. Any painting on canvas needs to be sealed because it lifts so easily. One spilt cup of tea and your painting will disappear. I'd recommend a spray varnish. A matte one will make it still look like watercolour. One with some UV protection would be great. And then potentially you could wax it if you want to do that, or leave it with that varnish finish. Don't use a brush on because that will smear the watercolour. I've already said that I've got other videos with painting tips, so look out for those. And I also do a full step-by-step course all about painting watercolour on canvas, so you could have a look at that over at my watercolour school. If you've tried watercolour on canvas, let us know what your experience was like. Did you love it? Did you hate it? What did you learn? And please don't forget to like and subscribe this video because every week I share tips and tricks about watercolour.